The Mongols don't ask for loyalty, they demand it. Break the rules that hold this club together and you don't get a warning, you don't get a meeting, you get visited. These are the 15 rules every Mongol lives. Rule 15. Loyalty to the club comes before everything. The first thing a Mongol's prospect learns is also the most important thing he will ever be taught inside the organization. Loyalty to the club is not one priority among several. It is the only priority that matters. Everything else, family, career, personal relationships, personal safety, exists in second place. This is not a casual commitment. This is not the kind of loyalty that most people experience in friendships or workplaces, where you support each other when it's convenient and maintain your own separate lives when it isn't. The Mongols' version of loyalty means that when the club calls, you answer. When the club needs something, you provide it. When a brother is in danger, you go. Not after you check your schedule, not after you explain to your wife where you're going. Now, the patch that a Mongol wears on his back represents this commitment in a physical, visible way. It is not a fashion statement or a hobby marker. It is a declaration, made publicly, every time the member wears his cut, that his primary allegiance is to the brotherhood. Men who wear the patch and then fail to honor what it represents are not simply considered unreliable. They are considered to have committed a specific kind of betrayal, the betrayal of a promise made voluntarily, with full understanding of what it required. The origin of this rule is inseparable from the club's founding. When a group of men who had been excluded by the establishment built their own organization from nothing, they depended entirely on each other. There was no institutional support, no legal protection, no backup from anyone outside the group. All they had was each other, and the only thing that made that enough was the absolute certainty that every man in the group was as committed as every other. Loyalty wasn't a virtue in that context. It was infrastructure. Decades later, the rule remains just as absolute, because the conditions that made it necessary haven't changed. The club still has serious enemies. Law enforcement still targets it with federal investigations. Rival clubs still represent a genuine physical threat. In that environment, hesitation is still dangerous, and loyalty is still the only reliable protection. The practical experience of this rule plays out in ways that are specific and documented. When Operation Black Rain went down in 2008, dozens of members were arrested in coordinated raids across multiple states. The members who were arrested and who maintained their loyalty, who took their charges without cooperating, who went to trial or took plea deals without giving information about other members, were treated as brothers in good standing when they eventually returned to the club. The members who broke, who offered information in exchange for reduced charges, who helped federal investigators build cases against other members, became enemies of the organization and faced the consequences that the club reserves for enemies. That specific dynamic, played out across multiple federal prosecutions over multiple decades, is what gives the loyalty rule its teeth. It is not enforced primarily through threats. It is enforced through the demonstrated reality of what loyalty produces: support, respect, standing, and what disloyalty produces: isolation, danger, and the specific shame of being marked as a man who broke when breaking was the worst thing he could do. Let me say one thing, and then I won't bring it up again. I have gathered everything you could possibly imagine about bikers and hidden secrets into this book. Available at my website, theinvestigator.com. If you want it, it is there. That is all. Rule 14. Respect the chain of command, without exception. The Mongols are structured like a military unit, not a social club. There is a national president at the top. Below him are chapter presidents. Below them are vice presidents, sergeants at arms, road captains, secretaries, and treasurers. Below them are full patch members. Below them are prospects. At no level in that chain does anyone have the luxury of deciding which orders to follow and which to question. The sergeant at arms position deserves specific attention because it is the role that most directly enforces the chain of command. The sergeant at arms is the club's internal enforcer, the person responsible for discipline, for making sure members follow the rules, for handling situations where someone has stepped out of line. The founding Mongol who held that position was Alonzo Big Al Avs, a Vietnam veteran whose reputation for violence was established long before the club existed. His approach to the role set the standard for what the position meant and what it demanded. When the chain of command is violated, when a member argues with a superior in front of other members, when a prospect fails to follow an instruction, when someone makes a unilateral decision that should have gone through leadership, the response is not a conversation, it is a consequence. The consequences can range from fines to physical discipline to loss of rank to expulsion, depending on the severity of the violation and the specific chapter's approach. The reason this rule exists is strategic, not just cultural. The Mongols have survived decades of federal investigations because their organizational structure limits the damage that any single arrest can do. When members don't know more than they need to know, and when the chain of command is maintained, law enforcement has a much harder time building the kind of comprehensive RICO case that dismantles an entire organization. The hierarchy exists, partly as a security measure, and violating it isn't just disrespectful, it's dangerous to the whole club. The specific roles within the Mongols' chapter structure have documented responsibilities that explain why the hierarchy matters beyond simple organizational preference. The road captain manages logistics for club rides, determining routes, coordinating with other chapters, managing the formation that the club travels in. A road captain who makes decisions based on his own preferences rather than the president's direction doesn't just create a minor inconvenience. He creates vulnerability, because the specific route a club takes on a ride can be the difference between a routine run and an ambush in contested territory. The secretary handles communications and records, which means he has access to information that could be extremely damaging if it reached the wrong people. A secretary who operates outside the chain of command, who shares information with people above or below him without authorization, who acts on instructions from members who don't have authority over his role, creates exactly the kind of security gap that federal undercover operations are designed to exploit. Every position in the hierarchy exists because the specific function it performs requires specific authority and specific accountability. The chain of command is not bureaucracy for its own sake, it is operational security. Rule 13. Protect the club's image and reputation. The Mongols' reputation is one of their most powerful assets. It discourages rivals from challenging them, creates a specific kind of street credibility that has real practical value, and communicates to anyone who is paying attention exactly what kind of organization they are dealing with. Protecting that reputation is not vanity, it is strategic necessity. Every member is part of that reputation. When a Mongol walks into a room wearing his cut, everyone in the room who knows what the patch means is making an assessment based on everything they know or have heard about the club. That assessment is shaped by the behavior of every member who ever represented the organization publicly. A single member who loses control, embarrasses the club, or creates a public incident that attracts unnecessary attention damages something that took decades to build. The specific consequences of reputation damage that matter most are twofold. First, a weakened reputation makes the club vulnerable to challenges from rival organizations who read weakness as an opportunity. Second, it attracts law enforcement attention of exactly the kind the club is always trying to minimize. Every unnecessary headline, every public brawl that didn't need to happen, every incident that puts the club on the front page, all of it creates legal exposure and invites the kind of federal scrutiny that has historically produced the investigations and prosecutions that hurt the organization most. Members are expected to project confidence and discipline, not recklessness. The image of outlaw freedom that the club presents publicly is deliberately cultivated. It is not the result of members doing whatever they want, whenever they want. It is the product of coordinated behavior that serves the club's interests. The way the club manages its public image is more sophisticated than most outsiders understand. The Mongols have, at various points in their history, made deliberate efforts to present a more organized and less criminal public, face charity rides, community events, the kind of public activity that creates positive associations with the name. Former national president David Santillan spoke publicly about wanting to reform the club's image and move it away from the criminal associations that federal prosecutors had worked to build through successive prosecutions. Those efforts are part of protecting the image too, and they are not simply cynical public relations exercises. They reflect a genuine internal debate about what the club's reputation should be and who it should be among. The motorcycle community that the Mongols come from the 1% outlaw biker world has its own standards of reputation, and the Mongols' standing in that world depends partly on how they are perceived by rival clubs, by independent riders, and by the broader biker community. Managing all of those perceptions simultaneously, while also managing what law enforcement and the general public think, requires the kind of consistent discipline that the image rule demands. The specific incident that best illustrates how quickly reputation damage can happen and how seriously the club treats it is the Laughlin Casino Brawl of 2002. 3 men died. The images of armed bikers fighting on a casino floor in front of horrified gamblers and dealers made national news. The event did not just damage the reputation of the clubs involved in the immediate media cycle. It triggered new law enforcement task forces, prompted casinos and event organizers to ban club colors at their venues, and gave federal prosecutors fresh ammunition for arguing that both the Hells Angels and the Mongols were criminal enterprises rather than motorcycle clubs. One public incident, in the wrong place with the wrong cameras watching, changed the legal and operational landscape for both organizations for years afterward. That is why the image rule is not about pride, it is about survival. Rule 12. Never cooperate with law enforcement. The Mongols' Code of Silence is one of the most strict and most seriously enforced rules in the club. It is not simply discouraged to talk to police, it is forbidden. Not under pressure, not in exchange for a reduced sentence, not to protect yourself. The rule is absolute because the threat that cooperation represents to the organization is absolute. When Roger Penny, a former Mongols president, had walked away from the Laughlin Casino Brawl in 2002, a fight that left 3 men dead and dozens injured, with only probation, while other participants received years in federal prison, the whisper inside the club world was that the sentencing disparity was not an accident. Whether he cooperated or not was never publicly established, but the question itself demonstrated the specific kind of damage that even the suspicion of cooperation creates inside the organization. When David Santillan, who served as Mongols' national president and publicly fought the federal government's attempt to seize the club's trademark, had a phone call with his estranged wife recorded and sent to club members, a call in which he used the phrase, "can't protect me," in reference to a retiring ATF agent. It destroyed 25 years of Rusty's loyalty in a single night. The club voted him out without letting him defend himself. Whether the interpretation was accurate or not was irrelevant. The appearance of cooperation was enough. The rule against talking to law enforcement extends beyond formal investigations. Casual conversations with police, any kind of cooperation with government inquiries, any contact that could be interpreted as providing information about the club or its members, all of it falls under the same prohibition. The reasoning is simple. The moment you start deciding which conversations with police are acceptable and which aren't, you've already started down a path that the club won't follow you back from. The history of ATF infiltration of the Mongols teaches a specific lesson about what happens when the Code of Silence fails. William Queen, the agent who infiltrated the club starting in 1998, he was able to build a comprehensive case, resulting in 53 convictions because he was present for 28 months of routine club activity. He didn't need members to actively betray each other. He simply needed to be in the room long enough to document what happened naturally. The members who were convicted weren't necessarily men who cooperated. They were men who trusted that the person they were speaking to in front of was who he claimed to be. That infiltration produced one of the most important changes in how the club approached the Code of Silence, not just the prohibition against speaking to law enforcement, but the broader security culture around information management and trust. The response to Queen's infiltration shaped how the club vetted new members, how it shared information within chapters, and how it understood the specific vulnerability that comes from extended contact with anyone whose history cannot be completely verified. Rule 11. The club comes before family. For civilians reading this from the outside, Rule 11 is probably the hardest one to understand. The idea that an organization could or should take precedence over your wife, your children, your parents, that feels extreme in a way that most of the other rules don't. But understanding why this rule exists requires understanding what the club actually provides that blood family cannot. The club provides backup in situations where blood family would be useless. Your wife cannot fight off a rival club. Your children cannot post bail at 2 a.m. when a chapter meeting ends badly. Your parents cannot provide the specific kind of legal and financial support that comes from an organization with established networks and resources. The club can. It has, historically, for members who needed it. The trade-off that club obligations come before family obligations is the price of that protection and that support. The rule also reflects a practical reality about what full membership in a serious outlaw club actually requires in terms of time. Church meetings are mandatory. Runs are mandatory. When the club needs members present, members are present. This isn't a hobby that you can dip in and out of around your family's schedule. It is a full commitment that shapes every aspect of your daily life. Women who partner with Mongols members either accept this reality early in the relationship or they don't stay. The ones who stay understand that the patch came before they did and will remain after they're gone. The tension this rule creates in members' personal lives is documented clearly enough through the accounts of former members who have spoken publicly. Justin Delareto, who founded the Mongols Oregon chapter and served 15 years as a chapter president before eventually leaving the club, described the accumulated personal cost of the commitment in terms that make the rule's weight clear. The rides, the meetings, the obligations that appeared without warning and had to be met regardless of what else was happening. All of it created a specific kind of pressure on every relationship that existed outside the club. The rule is also self-reinforcing in a way that makes it increasingly difficult to challenge over time. The more a member invests in the club, the more relationships he sacrifices, the more family time he misses, the more of his personal life he subordinates to the brotherhood, the more the club becomes his primary social world. The outside relationships weaken, while the inside relationships strengthen. Eventually, the rule becomes less something imposed from outside and more something the member genuinely feels, because the club has become the only place where the relationships are deep enough to matter. The specific financial dimension of this rule is worth understanding, because it clarifies that the club's priority over family is not simply about time and presence. It also involves money. Members are expected to pay dues on time, regardless of their personal financial situation. They are expected to contribute to legal defense funds for brothers who are arrested. They are expected to support the families of imprisoned members, even when doing so strains their own households. Club expenses take priority over personal expenses. And a member who is consistently unable or unwilling to meet his financial obligations to the club is not simply a member with money problems. He is a member whose commitment is being questioned. The financial obligations and the time obligations together create a total claim on a member's resources that leaves very little for anything outside the brotherhood. Rule 10. Always be ready to fight. The Mongols were born in conflict. They came into existence fighting for the right to be recognized as a legitimate outlaw club in territory controlled by the Hells Angels. They expanded by fighting, literally fighting, in bars and parking lots and casino floors for respect and territory. Every major chapter expansion in their history has been accompanied by violence, either defensive or offensive, against rival clubs that didn't want the Mongols moving into their geography. That history produces a specific culture around violence. It is not celebrated for its own sake. It is not considered something to seek out or to escalate unnecessarily. But it is also not something to avoid when it becomes necessary. And in the Mongols' world, the definition of necessary is fairly broad. A perceived disrespect. A rival club member in territory the Mongols claim. A situation where backing down would send a message about weakness. The shooting at the Shell gas station in Riverside, California, on the 21st of May 2017, where Joshua Herbert fired a .357 revolver into a group of Hells Angels who were simply refueling their motorcycles, killing James "Floppy" Duffy and wounding another, was presented in court as a deliberate act of gang violence, a Mongols member establishing his commitment to the club by attacking rivals in a situation where there was no provocation beyond the rivals' presence. The jury believed it. Herbert was convicted of first-degree murder. That case illustrates both the violence that the culture can produce and the legal consequences it creates. The Mongols, who have survived longest inside the club, men like Scott Jr. Erickson, who served 2 terms as national president, did time for manslaughter. and wrote books about the experience are the ones who understood that violence is a tool, not a reflex, and who used it strategically rather than impulsively. The Mongols' physical culture is rooted in their founding membership, Vietnam veterans who had been trained to respond to threats immediately and decisively, who had spent years in an environment where hesitation was fatal, and who brought that conditioning home with them and into the club. The 101st Airborne veterans, who were among the founders, men like Alonzo Big Al Aves, set a standard for physical readiness and willingness to engage violence that shaped the club's culture from its earliest days. The war with the Hells Angels reinforced and deepened that culture. When the first formal declaration of war came in 1977, both clubs were dealing with bombings, ambushes, and organized attacks that required members to maintain genuine readiness. The Mongols who survived that period were the ones who could respond when response was required. The ones who hesitated or backed down became cautionary tales that shaped every subsequent generation's understanding of what the rule required. The readiness rule also has a psychological dimension that goes beyond physical fighting capability. A member who projects confidence and readiness, who carries himself in a way that communicates he will not back down, avoids many of the confrontations that a member who projects uncertainty invites. The rule is partly about the ability to fight, and partly about the attitude that prevents fights from becoming necessary. Rule 9. Respect the patch and everything it represents. The Mongols patch the top rocker with the club name, the center image of Genghis Khan on a motorcycle, and the bottom rocker identifying the chapter is not, in the club's understanding, the property of the individual wearing it. It belongs to the club. The member is holding it in trust for as long as he remains in good standing. This distinction matters enormously in practice. A patch you personally own is yours to display, to modify, to eventually set aside when you no longer want to be associated with what it represents. A patch you are holding in trust for an organization is not yours to set aside. You cannot decide you've had enough and put it in a drawer. The club decides when you're done wearing it, not you. The legal battle over the trademark is worth understanding because it illustrates how seriously the club treats this principle. After the federal racketeering conviction of former national president Ruben Doc Cavazos, who pleaded guilty in January 2009 and agreed as part of his plea to forfeit all rights to the Mongols' trademarks, the government attempted to use that forfeiture to actually seize the patch. Federal agents theoretically had the authority to arrest anyone wearing the Mongols' logo in public. The club fought the seizure through the courts and ultimately won. Federal District Judge David Carter ruled in 2015 that the government couldn't seize the trademark on constitutional grounds. The club's identity, expressed through the patch, remained theirs. That is how much the patch matters to the Mongols. They went to federal court and won against the United States government rather than surrender control of it. The Mongols' founding choice to name themselves after Genghis Khan's empire was a deliberate statement about what they wanted the patch to represent. Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous land empire in history from nothing, starting with a small group of warriors who were surrounded by enemies and who had been told by the existing powers of their world that they didn't matter. The comparison to the Mongols' own founding 10 men excluded from an established club building their own organization was not accidental. The image on the patch, the Genghis Khan figure on a motorcycle, is a synthesis of that history and the present. It says, "We come from a tradition of conquest. We don't accept limits placed on us by others, and we will defend what is ours." Every time a member puts on his cut, he is asserting all of that. The physical act of wearing the patch is a public statement of identity and allegiance that carries weight precisely because of the history behind it and the rules that govern how it is held and displayed. The physical rules around the patch, rules that govern how it is handled, stored, and displayed, communicate the same principle in a practical register. The vest should never touch the ground. If it falls, you pick it up immediately. It is never washed in a machine, never loaned to another person, never displayed casually. When a member is hospitalized or arrested, getting the cut into the hands of another member before it falls into the hands of law enforcement or medical staff is a genuine priority. Federal investigators have documented specific cases in which Mongols members took significant personal risks to retrieve a brother's colors from situations where the alternative was leaving them in police custody. The specific intensity of that reaction, risking your own freedom to protect a piece of fabric, only makes sense when you understand that the fabric is not what is being protected. The identity it represents is. Rule 8. Earn it, don't buy it. The Mongols' membership process is designed to be difficult, not unnecessarily difficult, in the way that hazing can sometimes be purely performative, difficult in a way that is specifically calibrated to reveal character under pressure. A prospect's period inside the Mongols can last a year or significantly longer. During that time, he has no vote, he has no authority, he is at the bottom of the hierarchy and has no claim to any of the protection or respect that full membership provides. His job is to demonstrate, through consistent behavior over an extended period, that he is the kind of man the club wants to trust with its secrets and its reputation. What this looks like in practice includes tasks that are deliberately mundane and humbling, alongside tasks that are genuinely dangerous. Cleaning motorcycles, standing guard at meetings, running errands at odd hours, being in the right place when something needs handling without being told explicitly what that something is. The combination of the mundane and the serious is deliberate. It tests whether a man can maintain discipline and obedience across the full range of what club life actually requires, not just the dramatic parts. The former Mongols member, Justin Mooch de Loreto, who founded the Oregon chapter and eventually served 15 years as a chapter president before leaving the club, described the prospect period as a process of total submission that strips away everything you think makes you special and forces you to build your identity from the ground up inside the club's values. Men who cannot make that transition, who try to maintain their civilian sense of status or entitlement during the prospect period, don't survive it, and that failure is the point. The club doesn't want men who can't submit, it wants men who can, and who therefore can be trusted when submission is required in situations that actually matter. The contrast with other organizations that have, at various points, used money or social connections as shortcuts to membership is important for understanding why this rule matters so much to the Mongols. When Ruben Doc Cavazos became national president and began recruiting street gang members into the club without requiring them to go through the full prospect process, the reaction from old-school members was immediate and intense. These were men who had spent a year or more proving themselves before receiving the patch. The idea that someone could essentially be handed what they had sacrificed to earn was an insult to every member who had gone through the process honestly. That reaction is why the rule is more than tradition. It is the specific mechanism by which the club maintains the quality of its membership and the reliability of the trust relationships within it. When every member has earned his place through the same process, there is a shared baseline of demonstrated commitment that everyone can reference. The man beside you has proven he can take orders. He has proven he can maintain discipline under pressure. He has proven he will not quit when things become difficult. You know this because you watched him prove it, or because you know that the men who watched him accepted what they saw. Rule 7. Brotherhood is for life. There is no formal exit from the Mongols. This is not a policy that is written down and shown to prospects before they commit. It is a reality that they are expected to understand and accept before the patch is ever offered. Once you are in, you are in. The question of leaving does not arise in the way it might arise in other organizations, because the club treats the commitment as permanent from the moment it is made. This rule has documented consequences. When former national president David Santillan was voted out after the phone call incident, he did not leave voluntarily. He was expelled. The distinction matters because it illustrates the direction of decision-making. The club decides, not the member. When members have attempted to walk away without the club's blessing, the outcomes have ranged from hostile to dangerous. The patches are taken, the relationships are severed. And in documented cases, the men who left have spent time genuinely worried about their personal safety. The lifelong commitment also has a positive dimension that deserves acknowledgement. A Mongol who goes to prison can expect the club to maintain contact with his family, provide support where possible, and welcome him back into full standing when he is released. A Mongol who travels internationally can expect to find brothers in other chapters who will treat him as family even though they have never met. The network is real and it is genuinely valuable. The price of access to that network is the permanent commitment that the rule requires. The Mongols' international network is one of the most tangible expressions of what lifelong brotherhood actually provides. A member who travels to a country where the club has a chapter is not a tourist. He is a brother in a foreign chapter's territory, entitled to hospitality, to backup if needed, and to the specific social currency that comes from being part of an organization that is recognized and respected across international lines. That network only exists because of the permanence of the commitment. If members could leave whenever they wanted, taking their relationships and their knowledge with them, the network would collapse. The specific financial and logistical support the club provides to imprisoned members is another dimension of the same principle. Doing prison time for a club that then forgets you existed would be a catastrophic betrayal of the commitment members have made. The club's support for imprisoned brothers, maintaining relationships, supporting families, ensuring that the man coming out of prison returns to a brotherhood rather than nothing, is the positive expression of the same rule that makes leaving so costly. The commitment is real in both directions. The Mongols' handling of members who die in service to the club illustrates the positive dimension of lifelong brotherhood most clearly. When a member is killed, whether in a confrontation with a rival club, in an accident, or in the course of club-related activity, the club's response is comprehensive and genuine. Funerals are attended by members from across chapters, sometimes from across the country. The deceased member's family is supported financially where possible. His name and his patch are treated with a specific kind of institutional reverence that communicates to every living member what the club will do for them if their own time comes. That knowledge that the organization will honor you and take care of your family if you die in its service is one of the most powerful loyalty-generating forces that any organization can create. The Mongols have built it deliberately, through decades of consistent behavior, and it works. Rule 6. Respect the club's discipline. No excuses. Club meetings called church inside the Mongols, as in most outlaw clubs, are not optional. Attendance is mandatory. Missing a church meeting without a genuinely serious reason creates a problem for the member who missed it, because it signals to the rest of the chapter that he does not take his obligations seriously. And a man who doesn't take his obligations seriously in church is a man who might not take them seriously in more important situations. The discipline enforced inside the club extends to behavior outside it as well. A Mongol who drinks to the point of losing control and embarrasses the club publicly is not just making a personal mistake. He is damaging something that belongs to all of them. A member who gets into an unnecessary fight that attracts police attention creates legal exposure for anyone associated with the chapter. A member who runs his mouth about club business in front of people who shouldn't hear it creates exactly the kind of security vulnerability that federal investigations are designed to exploit. The club's response to disciplinary violations scales with the severity of the offense. Minor violations produce fines and formal reprimands. More serious violations, particularly those that create actual danger for other members, produce physical consequences. The most serious violations produce expulsion, and in the cases of informants and traitors, the consequences documented in federal court records go further than expulsion. The financial penalties that clubs impose for disciplinary violations, fines for missed meetings, fines for violations of specific rules, serve a dual purpose that is easy to overlook. Obviously, they create a financial deterrent that makes repeated violations costly, but they also create a documented record of member behavior that leadership can review over time to identify patterns. A member who is repeatedly fined for the same category of violation is demonstrating through his own financial record that he is not internalizing the rule being enforced. That pattern is actionable information for a chapter president deciding whether a member is a long-term fit for the organization. The physical discipline that can accompany serious violations in the Mongols and other outlaw clubs is one of the most misunderstood aspects of their culture from the outside. It looks brutal. It is brutal. But it exists within a specific context in which the men involved have all voluntarily committed to a world where certain kinds of violations have certain kinds of consequences, and where physical consequences are understood as part of the fabric of organizational life. The members who experience them and who remain in the club afterward typically describe them as moments that reinforced rather than weakened their commitment, not because they enjoyed the experience, but because surviving it confirmed their own ability to take what the life required. Rule 5. Respect every brother, regardless of rank. The hierarchy within the Mongols is absolute officers outrank regular members, senior members outrank junior ones, full members outrank prospects, but the hierarchy governs authority, not basic human dignity. Every man who has earned the patch has demonstrated, through the same trial-by-fire process, that he belongs inside the brotherhood. That shared trial is the foundation of a specific kind of equality that exists underneath the rank structure. This means that a chapter president who publicly humiliates a full patch member over a minor disagreement is not just being personally unpleasant, he is violating the club's code of respect and weakening the sense of shared dignity that makes the brotherhood real rather than merely nominal. It means that a senior member who treats a prospect with gratuitous cruelty beyond the legitimate testing that the prospect period requires is undermining the institution rather than strengthening it. The respect rule also has a specific application to how members represent each other to the outside world. Speaking negatively about a brother in public, complaining to outsiders about internal club conflicts, airing the club's dirty laundry in any forum outside the organization, all of it is treated as a violation of the respect code. The brotherhood defends its reputation collectively, and that defense requires that members never become the source of the reputation damage they are supposed to prevent. The specific mechanics of how respect is maintained inside a Mongols chapter is visible in how church meetings are run. Every full patch member has a voice at church. Not an equal voice, the president presides, the sergeant-at-arms enforces order, and hierarchy determines whose position carries more weight in any given decision. But every man who has earned his patch is heard. The decision-making process is not purely top-down dictatorship, though the final authority is clearly located at the top. It includes the input of the membership in ways that communicate that every member's perspective has value. This specific balance, absolute hierarchy in terms of authority, but genuine inclusion in terms of voice, is one of the things that makes club loyalty so sustainable over time. An organization where the rank and file are simply told what to do and never consulted produces resentment that eventually fractures it. An organization where everyone has an equal say becomes ungovernable. The Mongols approach hierarchy for decisions, respect for everyone who has earned the right to be heard, threads that needle in a way that has kept the club functional for more than 50 years. The specific ways that disrespect between members gets resolved inside the Mongols reveals how seriously the rule is taken. Minor disrespects, a dismissive comment, a public disagreement that should have stayed private, are typically handled in church. The offending member is expected to acknowledge the breach, and the matter is resolved through the chapter's normal decision-making process. More serious disrespects, actions that genuinely damage another member's standing or safety, go through the chain of command and can produce formal consequences. What the club specifically does not want is members taking unilateral action against each other outside the established process. Two brothers who have a conflict and settle it with fists in the parking lot without going through proper channels are not resolving their dispute the Mongols' way. They are creating a precedent for disorder that the hierarchy exists to prevent. The respect rule and the chain of command rule reinforce each other. You resolve conflicts through the hierarchy because you respect the brother you are in conflict with enough to let the process work. Rule 4. Keep club business inside the club. The Mongols have been infiltrated by federal agents twice in their history, once by William Queen, who spent 28 months undercover in the San Fernando chapter, starting in 1998, and rose to chapter treasurer before his role was revealed, producing 53 convictions, and again by 4 ATF agents in the 2008 Operation Black Rain, which resulted in 79 federal charges, including murder, racketeering, and drug trafficking. Both infiltrations succeeded because information moved inside the club in ways that the undercover agents could access. Queen became treasurer precisely because access to financial records provided access to evidence. The Black Rain operation succeeded in large part because the scale of the operation allowed multiple agents to cross-reference information and build comprehensive cases against multiple members simultaneously. The secrecy rule exists in direct response to these vulnerabilities, not just because law enforcement infiltration is a documented risk, but because any information that moves outside the club to family members, to friends, to anyone not bound by the same code of silence is information that can reach law enforcement through paths the club cannot control. A wife who overhears a conversation, a friend who knows too much and gets into trouble of his own, an associate who decides cooperation is worth the risk. Every pathway through which information escapes the club is a potential route to a federal indictment. The specific way the Code 55 was used after the 1999 killing at Gina's Bar in the City of Commerce illustrates how the secrecy rule functions in practice. When Mongols members killed a man they may have believed was connected to the Hells Angels, the club immediately enacted Code 5. 5 members were instructed not to wear their vests or patches, not to carry weapons, and to avoid contact with law enforcement. This wasn't a spontaneous decision, it was an existing protocol activated by leadership in response to a specific situation, communicated through the club's internal channels to chapter members. The Code 55 existed because someone had thought through, in advance, what needed to happen after incidents that drew police attention. That kind of premeditated security protocol is a product of the secrecy culture. An organization that thinks carefully about information management also thinks carefully about what happens when an incident occurs that could expose information the club needs to protect. The secrecy rule is not just about keeping mouths shut, it is about the entire operational security infrastructure that the club maintains to protect its members from the legal consequences of club life. The specific protocol that the Mongols use to communicate internally, including the use of coded language and the deliberate compartmentalization of sensitive information to only those who need it, reflects decades of adaptation to law enforcement surveillance. Members learn early that conversations inside a clubhouse can be monitored, that phones can be tapped, and that the person sitting next to them at a bar might not be who they say they are. The discipline this awareness produces the habit of speaking carefully, even in seemingly private settings. The instinct to share only what is necessary, with only the people who need to know, is one of the most valuable operational skills the club develops in its members. It is not paranoia. It is institutional memory, accumulated through exactly the kind of infiltrations that Queen's Operation and Black Rain represented, translated into behavioral habits that the next generation inherits from the one before it. Rule 3. Stand with your brothers through every challenge. The Laughlin Casino fight, on the 27th of April, 2002, in which approximately 60 to 70 Hells Angels and Mongols brawled on the casino floor with guns, knives, hammers, and wrenches, leaving 3 men dead and more than a dozen seriously injured, is one of the clearest documented examples of what this rule looks like in practice. When the fight started with a single kick, every member of both clubs present responded within seconds. There was no individual assessment of whether to get involved. There was no waiting to see how the situation developed. The response was collective and immediate, because in that world, that is the only acceptable response. The rule extends beyond physical confrontations. When members go to prison, brothers are expected to provide financial support to their families. When members face legal costs, the club helps fund defense. When someone is injured, others cover responsibilities he can no longer meet. The social safety net that the club provides to its members is genuine, and it functions because every member understands that they may need it themselves, and that the only way it exists is if everyone contributes to it. The consequences of failing to stand with a brother are severe and lasting. A man who disappears when his brothers need him, who finds reasons not to show up, not to respond, not to engage, loses the trust that is the only currency that matters inside the club. And losing that trust, in an organization where trust is the foundation of every relationship, means losing everything the membership was supposed to provide. The murder of Shane Bowden in Queensland, Australia, in October 2021, bullets fired into his black BMW in his girlfriend's driveway. By men whom investigators connected to the Mongols chapter, there is an extreme illustration of what standing with your brothers means when a former member has become an enemy. Bowden had been kicked out of the Victorian chapter for assaulting another member, and had then made the specific error of joining the Finks, one of the Mongols' primary rivals in Australia. A GPS tracker was placed on his car weeks before the shooting. His location was monitored. When the time was right, the response was organized and precise. This is the darkest version of the brotherhood principle, the one where the obligation to stand with your brothers extends to confronting people who have been designated enemies of the organization. Regardless of whether those people used to be brothers themselves, the man who is expelled from the club and joins a rival organization has not simply left. He has become an active threat to the brotherhood he once belonged to, and the rule that standing with your brothers requires active response to threats extends to threats that used to be members. That is what makes the brotherhood permanent in both directions. You can't simply walk away from it, and the organization can't simply forget about you either. Rule 2. Put the club above yourself. The ego is one of the most dangerous things a Mongols member can bring to the table. An individual whose personal ambition, personal pride, or personal agenda conflicts with the club's needs is a potential source of internal fracture, and internal fracture is the thing the club has most to fear from, because external enemies are manageable. Internal division is what actually kills organizations. Former national president Ruben Doc Cavazos is the cautionary tale here. Under his leadership, the Mongols expanded dramatically. He recruited street gang members from his old Avenue connections, relaxed the Harley-Davidson requirement that had previously been absolute, and grew the club in ways that earlier leadership would not have approved. Old-school members blamed him for changing what the club was. By August 2008, the Mongols voted him out before the federal indictment came, not because of it. His own organization removed him because they believed he had started running the club for his own benefit rather than the brotherhood's. That removal happened through the club's own process, by members applying their own judgment about what was best for the organization. It is the clearest possible example of the club's assertion that no individual is bigger than the patch, not even the national president. The internal politics of how the Mongols removed Doc Cavazos in August 2008, before the federal indictment came, based on the membership's own assessment of his leadership, demonstrates what this rule looks like when it functions correctly. The members who voted him out were not acting on instructions from law enforcement or from any external pressure. They were making an organizational judgment that the current national president had stopped putting the club first and was using the organization's resources and reputation for his own benefit. That kind of self-correction requires that the members doing the correcting have internalized the principle that the club matters more than any individual's position within it. It requires that the officers and members who voted to remove their own president understood that their loyalty was to the organization, not to the man who currently led it. And it demonstrates that the rule is not simply something imposed from the top of the hierarchy. It is a principle that can operate against the top of the hierarchy when the top fails to honor it. The rule about putting the club above yourself also shapes how members are expected to handle success. A member who becomes financially successful through business ventures connected to the club, through the protection the club's name provides, through relationships the club makes possible, through opportunities that club membership creates, is expected to redirect some of that success back into the organization. This is not always a formal requirement, but it is a cultural expectation that is enforced informally through the respect the successful member receives and loses based on whether he handles his success with appropriate generosity toward the brotherhood. The man who gets rich using the club's name and keeps everything for himself is not simply stingy. He is taking from the organization without giving back. That calculation does not go unnoticed, and it does not go unremarked in the conversations that determine a member's standing. Rule 1. Never betray the brotherhood. Everything else in this list, the loyalty, the chain of command, the secrecy, the discipline, the respect, exists to protect this one rule. The prohibition against betrayal is the roof of the entire structure. Pull it down, and everything underneath collapses. Betrayal in the Mongols' world takes a very specific and concrete form that goes beyond the abstract sense of the word. It means giving information to law enforcement. It means stealing from the club or from a brother. It means breaking the code of silence under legal pressure. It means cooperating with an investigation that could put brothers in federal prison. It means being the person who, in exchange for personal benefit, becomes the instrument of the organization's destruction. Joel Silver's murder lured to the Fresno clubhouse in July 2014, shot in the back of the head, secretly cremated to destroy evidence. His family denied even a body to grieve was not a story about the Mongols. It was a Hell's Angels case. But the principle it illustrated is the same one that governs the Mongols' understanding of what betrayal deserves. The men who made the decisions in that case, chapter presidents who decided together that a brother who had caused problems needed to be permanently dealt with, were applying the same organizational logic that the Mongols apply. To the question of betrayal, problems of this magnitude are handled permanently, and the men who handled the Silver case are now serving mandatory life sentences, which is its own reminder that the consequences of these decisions run in multiple directions. The Mongols have survived more than 50 years of federal investigations, rival club violence, internal power struggles, and sustained law enforcement pressure. They have done it by treating the prohibition against betrayal as genuinely absolute, not as a rule that applies until circumstances make violation pragmatic, but as the foundational principle that the entire organization depends on. Every federal prosecution that has damaged the club has traced back, in some form, to someone who broke this rule, and every prosecution that has failed to land has done so because the rule held. The specific documented cases of what happens to men who broke Rule 1 inside the Mongols' world provide the clearest possible illustration of what the rule actually means in practice. David Santillan, whose phone call implied possible cooperation with ATF, was voted out of his position as national president after 25 years of service without being allowed to speak in his own defense. Whatever the actual truth of the situation, the club's response was immediate and absolute. The appearance of betrayal was enough. The Ruben Doc Cavazos case provides a different angle. He pleaded guilty in January 2009 and admitted that he had led, in the government's words, a murdering, drug-dealing criminal conspiracy. His plea agreement included forfeiture of the club's trademark rights, meaning he agreed, on behalf of the organization, to give the government control over the patch that every Mongol considered sacred property. The club had already removed him before the indictment. But his plea represented a specific and definitive version of Rule 1 violation, placing his own legal outcome ahead of the club's fundamental interests. What both cases illustrate is that Rule 1 is not primarily about the dramatic, violent betrayals that make headlines. It is about the accumulation of smaller decisions that, over time, reveal whether a man's primary loyalty is to the club or to himself. The members who have maintained Rule 1 over decades of legal pressure, who have taken their sentences, done their time, and returned to the Brotherhood, are the foundation on which the organization stands. The men who broke it are the cautionary tales that every new member learns about during his prospect period, so that he understands exactly what the rule means before he ever earns the right to wear the patch it protects. 15 rules, 50-plus years, multiple federal investigations, 2 major undercover operations, a legal fight that went all the way to federal district court over the right to keep their own patch, and the club is still here. That tells you something. Organizations that survive that kind of sustained pressure do not survive by accident. They survive because the people inside them believe in the rules enough to pay the price those rules demand. Some of those prices are prison sentences, some of them are broken families, some of them are lives that ended inside a Fresno clubhouse or a casino parking lot or on a California highway. The Mongols are not asking anyone from the outside world to admire that. They never have. What they are saying, through every rule on this list, is that what they have built is worth the price they have paid to build it. Whether the outside world agrees is a question they stopped asking a long time ago. Subscribe and hit the bell. There are more stories like this coming, and none of them get simpler. The Mongols' survival is not an accident. It is the product of these 15 rules, applied consistently and enforced seriously across more than 50 years and multiple countries. Organizations that lack this kind of internal discipline don't last 5 decades. They collapse under the first serious legal pressure, or fracture when internal disputes go unresolved, or dissolve when the shared purpose that held them together loses its grip on the membership. The fact that 2 major federal undercover operations, multiple state and federal prosecutions, sustained law enforcement pressure, and the government's attempt to literally seize the club's trademark have all failed to destroy the Mongols is the strongest argument for the effectiveness of the rules. They work. Not in a way that prevents consequences for individual members, the prisons hold plenty of Mongols, but in a way that keeps the organization functional and the brotherhood intact across generations of membership. The men who built these rules paid for them. The men who follow them today pay for them too. Every rule on this list has a cost, and the cost is real in freedom, in family, in years spent inside federal institutions.